6 years ago he left and never came back. A soldier went missing in the midst of a brutal war. No body, no goodbye. Was he truly dead, or was there a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered? Then, on a rainy night, a dog appeared at the doorstep of his grieving wife. In its mouth was something no one expected, a military dog tag belonging to the husband she lost. How did it find its way home after all these years? Was this man really gone, or was there a mystery yet to be revealed? Follow this emotional story with Dog Stories. If you love tales of loyalty and love beyond boundaries, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And now, let's uncover the truth. The night wind carried a chilling breeze, slipping through the cracks of an old window, making the thin curtains sway inside a small suburban home in Tennessee. The dim glow of the streetlight cast a faint reflection on a framed photograph resting on the table. A man in uniform, his smile bright, yet his eyes unwaveringly resolute. That man was Anthony Scott, the soldier who left and never came back. Sitting by the window, Aria Faith clutched her wedding ring tightly in her hand. 6 years had passed since the day she received the news. His military convoy had been ambushed. No body was ever found, just a cold, impersonal message. Missing in action, presumed dead. She once believed Anthony was still out there somewhere, but as the years slipped away, so did that belief. Now Aria no longer cried. Her tears had long dried up. All that remained was an empty void, a quiet ache, like the darkness settling over the rain-soaked night. In the next room, Leo, her 8-year-old son, had already drifted into sleep, clutching a worn-out teddy bear, the same one Anthony had bought him before he left. The boy barely remembered his father, but every night before he closed his eyes, he would whisper, "Mom, Dad's coming back, right?" Aria no longer knew how to answer. The memories of Anthony were fading, slipping further away like a dream dissolving at sunrise. But tonight, something was different. Barking in the night, woof, woof. A sudden bark shattered the silence outside the front porch. Aria's body tensed. The sound was rough, insistent, urgent, not the aimless barking of a stray. This bark had purpose. She frowned. This neighborhood was always quiet. There were no stray dogs around here. She glanced at the clock. 2 a.m. Who would let their dog wander outside at this hour? The barking didn't stop. A strange feeling crept over Aria, sending a chill down her spine. Something wasn't right. Slowly, she stood up, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders before stepping toward the door. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. The door let out a long, eerie groan as she pushed it open. And there, standing on the porch, was a dog. A German shepherd, its black and gray fur soaked and matted with dirt. Strong, but weary. Scars ran along its body, telling the story of battles long fought. This wasn't a stray. This was a warrior. But what made Aria freeze in place wasn't the dog itself. It was what it held in its mouth, a military dog tag. The wind howled louder. The rain grew heavier, pelting against the wooden porch. Aria felt her chest tighten as her eyes locked onto the worn metal surface. A message from the past. Name, Anthony Scott, service number, 518-92-7435. Her hands trembled, her breath hitched. This can't be. This was no coincidence. This dog tag had vanished along with Anthony 6 years ago. Slowly, the dog stepped forward and gently placed the tag into her palm. Then, it took a step back. Its deep, unwavering eyes locked onto hers. It was waiting. Those eyes, they weren't frightened, they weren't aggressive. Instead, they held certainty, purpose, as if this dog had a mission. Aria felt a tightness in her chest. She looked up at the dog, and for the first time in years, a fragile thread of hope wove its way into her heart. How could a dog carry Anthony's dog tag back home after all these years? Was Anthony truly dead? Or was there a truth yet to be uncovered? Who was this dog? Where had it come from? Questions swirled through her mind, each one heavier than the last. But one thing was certain. This was no coincidence. Tonight, the past had returned, and it came with a message. The night wind still howled through the trees, but Aria no longer felt the cold. She clutched the dog tag tightly, the icy metal sending a chill through her palm, soaked with rain. The dog stood motionless in front of her, its eyes never leaving hers, as if it was waiting. Aria swallowed hard, wiping the raindrops off the worn surface of the tag. She had already seen Anthony's name, but as she turned it over under the porch light, a new detail emerged, a set of coordinates, etched by hand. The numbers were deeply engraved into the metal, Not worn by time, but carved with intent. 37 degree 3045 2 nen 158 40.5 though you. Arya's eyes widened. Her heart pounded. Coordinates. What did these numbers mean? Who had put them there? And most importantly, why had this dog tag found its way back to her after all these years? She looked down at the dog again. It still stood there, unwavering. Not lost. Not afraid. It knew exactly what it was doing. A shiver ran down Arya's spine. If this was a clue, she couldn't ignore it. Her phone vibrated on the table as she dialed a familiar number. Nolan Reed. He had been Anthony's closest friend in the military, serving alongside him in the same mission where he went missing. After leaving the service, Nolan Reed had all but disappeared from the world, living a quiet, detached life. But if there was anyone who could help her understand this dog tag, it was him. The phone rang several times before a deep, gravelly voice finally answered. Arya? What's going on? Arya took a deep breath, then spoke plainly. I need you to come over, right now. A pause. I just got a message from Anthony. Silence. Then Nolan's voice came through again, a tone she had never heard from him before. A mix of shock, doubt, and something else. I'm on my way. 30 minutes later, Nolan's Jeep rolled to a stop in front of Arya's house. He stepped out, clad in a worn leather jacket, his hair slightly disheveled. His sharp gaze swept over the scene, analyzing everything the moment his feet hit the ground. But then, he saw the dog, standing motionless on the porch, watching him. Nolan froze. His eyes widened. Holy hell, Arya, do you even know what dog this is? Arya frowned. What do you mean? Nolan took slow, measured steps forward, his gaze locked on the animal. This isn't just any dog. This is a military canine. Arya's breath caught. A canine? Are you sure? Absolutely. Look at it. The stance, the way it holds itself, the way it scans everything around it. This dog is trained. It's not a stray. And most importantly, Nolan crouched down, carefully pulling back the damp fur on the dog's chest. Beneath it, a worn military collar gleamed under the porch light. Etched into the metal tag was a single name. Shadow. Arya's heart pounded. This dog had a name. Nolan let out a slow breath, stepping back. Shadow was one of the canines that served with Anthony. It went missing the same day he did, after the ambush. Arya could barely process what she was hearing. 6 years ago, both Anthony and Shadow disappeared, and now, Shadow had come back. But if it's here, what does that mean? Nolan didn't answer right away. His expression darkened. It could be a lead. If it found its way back, maybe it wants us to follow. Arya turned the dog tag over in her palm, pointing at the set of coordinates. Do you know where this is? Nolan glanced at the numbers, his instincts kicking in. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and punched the coordinates into a military mapping app. A few seconds later, a red dot appeared on the screen. Damn it! This is near the Middle Eastern border, an old refugee camp. Arya swallowed hard. Why would these coordinates be on Anthony's dog tag? Nolan didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched down, holding his phone up in front of Shadow. On the screen was an old photo, Anthony in his military uniform standing alongside his unit and Shadow. The moment Shadow saw the image, its reaction was immediate. The dog let out a sharp, resounding bark, its eyes flashing with recognition. Then, in a frantic motion, it lunged toward Nolan's phone, pawing at the screen, as if trying to reach its long-lost master. Shadow still remembered Anthony. Arya tightened her grip on the dog tag. If Shadow had found its way back, then maybe Anthony had never died. She turned to Nolan, her eyes filled with determination. We have to go. Right now. A flight to the unknown. The cargo plane trembled as it cut through thick clouds. Arya sat in her seat, staring at her phone screen. Anthony's face stared back at her, the man she loved, Leo's father, the soldier who had vanished without a trace. Beside her, Nolan Reed fastened his seatbelt, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin. But this time, something was different. His voice was lower, edged with concern as he turned to her. Are you sure about this? We're heading straight into a war zone. Arya didn't blink. I can't turn back now. At their feet, Shadow, the canine unit that once served alongside Anthony, lay still, but his body was tense. He knew something was coming. The coordinates engraved on the dog tag had led them here, to a refugee camp near the Middle Eastern border. It was once a conflict hotspot, but now it was quieter. Too quiet. From what Nolan had gathered, there was a man living there. A nameless American soldier. The locals called him the amnesiac hero. Arya tightened her grip on the armrest. If that man was really Anthony, she would do whatever it took to bring him home. The first sign. As they stepped onto the tarmac of a small town near the border, a wave of blistering heat engulfed them. The air was thick with dust and sand, dry and suffocating. Arya felt it clawing at her throat, but she didn't care. A pickup truck was already waiting, driven by one of Nolan's local contacts. Shadow leapt onto the back, his eyes sharp, scanning everything around them. The refugee camp is about 2 hours from here, but there's a problem, the contact said, his voice low and cautious. There have been rumors of a militant group operating near the area. Arya didn't hesitate. We're going. The truck rumbled to life, rolling down the cracked, dusty road. Outside, the ruins of war stretched endlessly. Collapsed buildings, abandoned homes, and landscapes scarred by conflict. Arya could feel the weight of this place pressing down on her. But Shadow sensed something else. The closer they got to the refugee camp, the more tense Shadow became. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and his nose twitched constantly, sniffing the air. Nolan noticed immediately. This dog knows we're getting close. Arya's voice wavered slightly. Close to what? Nolan's gaze didn't waver. Close to Anthony. The makeshift gates of the refugee camp came into view, a patchwork of wooden fences and weathered tarps. Inside, hundreds of displaced people crowded together, their faces weary, their eyes filled with silent desperation. As Arya and Nolan stepped out of the truck, curious eyes turned toward them. But before they could take it all in, Shadow suddenly bolted forward. Without hesitation, Shadow sprinted straight into the camp, barking loudly, calling for someone. "Shadow, wait!" Arya shouted, but the dog didn't stop. She and Nolan took off after him, weaving through the dusty, uneven paths between the makeshift shelters. Every pair of eyes in the camp turned toward them. And then, an elderly man dressed in traditional local attire stepped forward. He stared at Shadow for a long moment before shifting his gaze to Arya. This dog. I've seen it before. Arya's heart pounded. Where? When? The man lowered his voice. It used to follow an American soldier. A man who doesn't remember who he is. Arya's grip tightened. Can you take me to him? The old man studied her for a long moment before giving a slow nod. They followed him through the narrow pathways of the camp, weaving between the makeshift tents and shelters. The closer they got, the more restless Shadow became. He barked non-stop, pawing at the ground as if desperate to break into a full sprint. Arya felt like time itself was slowing down. The old man came to a stop. There, that's him. Arya froze. In the distance, beneath the shade of a tree, a man stood in silence. He wore a faded military jacket, his hair longer than the last time Arya had seen him. His face was leaner, sun-worn, marked by years of hardship. But his eyes, they belonged to Anthony Scott. Arya's heart stopped. Anthony? Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but Shadow heard it. The dog bolted forward, barking with pure joy. The man flinched, turning sharply at the sound. And in that moment, his eyes met Arya's. But instead of recognition, they were completely empty. A cold wave crashed over her. He doesn't recognize me. Nolan stood frozen beside her, just as shocked. Anthony Scott, the husband who had been missing for 6 years, was standing right in front of them. But he wasn't Anthony anymore. The air in the refugee camp felt heavier, almost suffocating, as Arya Faith faced the man before her. He had Anthony's face, the same man she had mourned for years. But his eyes were empty, hollow, like someone who had no memory of the life he once had. Shadow stood beside Anthony, wagging his tail softly, waiting for a sign, a spark of recognition. But Anthony only stared at him blankly. Arya's voice was barely steady. You don't recognize this dog? Anthony blinked, his gaze flickering for a brief moment, but then it turned cold. I'm sorry, but who are you? The words cut through Arya like a knife. Nolan clenched his fists beside her, his jaw tightening. Then he stepped forward. He needed answers. Scott, you really don't remember anything? The man in front of him furrowed at the name, but there was no real recognition. Nolan inhaled deeply, then spoke slowly, deliberately. I'm Nolan Reed. We fought together. You are Anthony Scott, a U.S. Army sergeant. You and I served in the same unit during a mission 6 years ago, and you went missing after an ambush. Anthony stared at him. No flicker of recognition, no reaction. I don't know what you're talking about. Silence settled heavily between them. An aged voice spoke from behind them. He doesn't remember his past, but I can tell you about the life he has lived for the past 6 years. They all turned. It was the elderly man they had met earlier, the one who had called him the amnesiac hero. He gestured for them to follow and led them to a small, secluded tent, set apart from the rest of the camp. Once they were seated, he began. He arrived here 6 years ago, on a night of blood and fire. When we found him, he was lying among the ruins after a raid. His body was battered, his head was bleeding, but he was still alive. He didn't remember his name, his home, his unit, nothing. All he knew was that he was a soldier. Anthony lifted his gaze to the old man. What was it? Even he wanted to know the answer. The old man gave a small, sorrowful smile. You said you had to protect the weak. So you stayed. You fought alongside us. You defended this village, stopped militant raids. You became a warrior, not for any country, but for what was right. Arya bit her lip, struggling to hold back the tears burning in her eyes. Her husband had never lost who he was, but he had forgotten his family. With trembling hands, she pulled out an old photograph, one taken just before he left for deployment. It was a picture of her, Anthony, and Leo. She placed it in front of him. Do you remember? Anthony took the photo, staring at it for a long time. His eyes flickered. Something shifted. His brow twitched. Then his voice came, quiet and distant. Who is this child? Arya's heart clenched. That's your son, Leo. Anthony blinked rapidly, as if something in his mind was trying to break through, but couldn't. I don't know. I don't remember. Arya couldn't take it anymore. Do you have any idea how long I've waited? 6 years, Anthony. 6 years. I thought you were dead, but you weren't. You were here, living another life, without me, without Leo. Tears streamed down her face, but Anthony could only stare at her with empty eyes. He remembered nothing. Nolan suddenly stood up, slamming his palm against the table. Scott, for Fa's sake, do you even realize what you left behind? You had a family, a wife, a son who's been waiting for you to come home. Anthony remained silent. The words felt foreign, as if they belonged to a life that wasn't his. A sudden sharp pain shot through his head. Fragments of something, memories, maybe, flashed by, too fast to grasp. Then, out of nowhere, Shadow leaped up, placing both front paws on Anthony's chest. Woof! Anthony's gaze dropped to the dog. His hand, almost instinctively, reached out, brushing against its fur. Something about it felt familiar. His fingers trembled, and in the depths of his mind, the darkness began to shift. Arya wiped her tears. Her voice, though unsteady, was firm. Anthony, if you don't remember, then let me help you. I don't care how you've lived here. What matters is, you're not alone. We'll find what's been lost, together. Anthony looked into her eyes. For a split second, something flickered, a feeling, a shadow of recognition. It wasn't enough to break the wall in his mind, but it cracked, and that was all Arya needed. She wasn't giving up, not now. The air inside the tent was thick with tension after the emotional exchange between Arya and Anthony. He still couldn't remember his past, but deep inside, something had begun to shift. Anthony rubbed his temple, wincing as a sharp pain flashed through his head when he looked at the family photo Arya had given him. A blurry image flickered in his mind. A young boy laughing as he jumped into his arms. A woman, her eyes filled with love and warmth. The darkness in his mind stirred, but just as he reached for it, it slipped away, like sand falling through his fingers. His chest rose and fell in a heavy breath. I can't remember. Beside him, Shadow, the canine who had once served by his side, sat still, his sharp eyes locked onto his former handler. He refused to accept this silence, and then he acted, commands etched in memory. Suddenly, Shadow sat up straight, his posture shifting into full alertness. His eyes sharpened, his entire demeanor changed. Nolan Reed, the man who had fought beside Anthony, noticed it immediately. He took a small step back, watching the dog closely. Scott, you trained him, didn't you? Anthony didn't answer. Nolan inhaled deeply, then spoke in a firm, commanding tone. Shadow, sit! Instantly, the dog obeyed. Silence filled the tent. Everyone watched. Nolan took another step forward, his voice steady. Shadow, stay! Shadow remained still, his gaze locked onto Anthony. Then Nolan turned to Anthony, his eyes filled with challenge. Scott, you trained this dog. You know the commands. Try it. Anthony stiffened, his hands clenched unconsciously. A chill ran down his spine. He looked down at Shadow. The dog looked right back, his eyes filled with expectation. Something stirred deep inside Anthony, not a memory, not recognition, but instinct. His mouth opened, and before he even realized it, the words came out. "Shadow, come." Shadow sprang forward instantly, bounding toward Anthony with absolute excitement. He barked loudly, his tail wagging furiously. He nudged his head against Anthony's leg, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. Anthony's hand instinctively reached down, his fingers brushing against the familiar fur. And then the memories hit him. A sharp pain flashed through his skull, but this time he didn't fight it. He let it in, and suddenly it was all there. The ambush, clear as day. Gunfire erupted, deafening. Thick smoke billowed from the convoy under attack. Anthony saw himself dragging a wounded soldier out of the wreckage. Shadow was right there beside him, guarding his flank, his sharp eyes scanning for danger. Then, an explosion. Everything went black. He remembered searing pain in his head, blood trickling down into his eyes, and then nothing. When he woke up, his past was gone. Now, standing in the dimly lit tent, his breath came in ragged gasps. He took a step back, eyes wide. He remembered. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know who he was. His gaze snapped to Nolan, then to Arya. His throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. I really had a family." Arya wiped her tears, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small worn box. "There's something else. You wrote this for me before you left." She opened the box and carefully took out a letter, yellowed with age. Anthony's hands trembled as he took it. Slowly, he unfolded the fragile paper, his eyes scanning the words written in his own handwriting. "My dearest Arya, if you're reading this, it means I'm far away. But no matter where I am, know that my heart will always belong to you and Leo." Anthony clenched the letter in his hands, his breath shaky. "I wrote this." His fingers quivered, and for the first time in 6 years, tears fell. There was no more doubt. He was Anthony Scott. He had a family, a wife who had waited for him, a son whose childhood he had missed. He had lost too much. Arya grasped his hand, her voice filled with fragile hope. "Do you remember now?" Anthony took a deep breath. His gaze shifted to Shadow, then back to Arya. And this time his eyes were different. The wall inside his mind was finally crumbling. He gave a slow, unsteady nod. His voice was hoarse but clear. "I remember." Arya broke down in tears, but this time they weren't of grief. They were tears of joy. But outside, in the shadows, something still lurked. Because war wasn't over yet, and Anthony was about to face the hardest choice of his life. Inside the small tent, the flickering oil lamp cast shifting shadows across Anthony Scott's face. His memories had returned, piece by piece, forming a picture that was finally whole. He knew who he was. He knew Arya and Leo were waiting for him. But with that realization came a harsh truth. 6 years had passed, and he was no longer the same man. Here, in the heart of a war-torn land, he had become a part of this place. He had fought to protect the helpless, the orphaned children, the families caught between gunfire. If he left now, who would protect them? Nolan pushed into the tent, his expression tense. "Scott, we've got a problem." Anthony looked up. "The militants are moving in. This camp could be under attack at any moment." Arya's face went pale. "What?" Nolan turned to her, his voice firm. "We're running out of time. If we hesitate any longer, we won't get out of here." Arya spun toward Anthony, desperation in her eyes. "Then we have to leave. Now. Anthony, we can help evacuate these people before it's too late." But Anthony didn't answer. He simply stared down at his hands, scarred, rough, worn by war. He knew he could walk away right now. But what about them? The people outside had no choice. For 6 years he had fought for them, bled for them. If he turned his back on them now, would that be betrayal? Outside the tent, Shadow sat in silence, his eyes gleaming in the darkness, fixed on Anthony, waiting for his decision. Arya stepped closer, grasping her husband's hand tightly. "Anthony, I know you've changed, but Leo needs you. I need you. Our family, we're still here." Her voice trembled. "Please, don't lose everything again." Anthony's hand shook. He wanted to leave. He wanted to go home, but his heart was torn in two. Nolan spoke softly, his voice carrying a brutal truth. "Scott, if you stay, you'll die." Anthony clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "If I leave, they'll die." No one spoke. Outside, distant gunfire echoed through the night. War was closing in. Arya broke down, gripping Anthony's shirt with trembling hands. "If you stay, then what were the last 6 years of my waiting for? Leo grew up without you, but he never stopped believing that one day his father would come home. If you walk away from that now, do you understand how much it will hurt him? Anthony bowed his head. He knew. He had missed so much. Leo's birthdays. The nights Arya stayed awake, comforting a child who wouldn't stop asking when his father was coming back. But he couldn't turn his back on this place. Arya saw it in his eyes, and it broke her. Anthony, her voice cracked. Don't make me lose you again. The final decision. Outside, the gunfire grew louder. Nolan turned to Anthony, urgency in his tone. We have to go, right now. Arya held her breath, waiting for Anthony to choose. His chest ached as if his heart was splitting in two, but deep down, he already knew his answer. He turned to Arya, his voice steady but heavy. You go home first. Arya's eyes widened. No, you can't do this. Anthony gently cupped her face, his touch filled with unspoken pain. I won't let you and Leo be in danger. But if you stay, I have to stay. Arya shook her head, tears falling uncontrollably. No, I won't leave without you. Nolan gripped her shoulders firmly. Arya, we have to go. Now. If we don't, we all die here. Shadow whimpered, licking Anthony's hand, as if begging him to change his mind. Anthony knelt down, running a hand over the loyal dog's head. Shadow, protect them. The dog let out a soft bark as if it understood. No, Anthony. Arya's scream ripped through the air. Don't do this to me. Don't do this to Leo. Anthony took a deep, steady breath before leaning down and pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I love you, Arya. Take care of Leo for me. Arya sobbed, thrashing as Nolan pulled her away, forcing her to move. She fought, she screamed, but the door to fate had already closed. As Arya, Nolan, and Shadow disappeared into the night, Anthony turned his back to them and faced the war ahead. Anthony drew his gun, his grip firm, his eyes no longer uncertain. In the distance, flames erupted, casting an eerie glow against the night sky. The militants had arrived. He tightened his hold on the weapon, standing his ground in the land he had called home for 6 years. This was no longer America's war. This was his war. Anthony Scott was no longer a man without a past. He knew who he was, and he knew what he had to do. The sky was pitch black, the air inside the refugee camp thick with tension. Children were hidden deep inside the tents. The men stood ready, clutching whatever they could use as weapons. Knives, wooden clubs, even jagged scraps of metal. They were outgunned, but they wouldn't go down without a fight. Anthony Scott stood alone in the darkness, gripping his gun tightly. He had once believed he could reclaim his old life, but now the life he had chosen to stay behind for had called him back. Then, the first sound shattered the silence. Boom! An explosion tore through the night. Screams erupted across the camp. Fire roared near the front gates, casting chaotic shadows as figures surged forward. The militants had arrived. Their silhouettes flickered against the raging flames. They were armed to the teeth, shouting in a language Anthony knew all too well. They weren't here to negotiate. Anthony took a deep breath, his eyes cold as steel. He was no longer a soldier without a past. He knew exactly what needed to be done. The fighter within returns. He charged toward the camp's defenders, signaling them to fall back. Get the women and children behind cover. Don't let them breach the fence. He turned to the elderly man who had cared for him all these years. Is there an escape route? The old man hesitated. There's a path behind the camp, but get them out of here. I'll hold them off. The old man hesitated, but something in Anthony's eyes made him nod. The first gunshots rang out. Rebels stormed in. Anthony crouched down and raised his weapon. Here we go. Just as the rebels closed in, a jeep skidded along the sandy road, barreling straight into the camp. Nolan Reed jumped out, weapon in hand. I knew you wouldn't leave without causing trouble, Scott. You could have left me behind, but you didn't. Nolan smiled, flicking off the safety. I never leave a teammate behind. The two stood shoulder to shoulder, guns raised. Rebels poured in from every direction. They had nowhere to retreat. Shadow and the life-saving mission. Meanwhile, not far from the fighting, Arya and Shadow were heading out with the villagers. But Arya couldn't do it. She couldn't leave while Anthony was still fighting. Turn around. The driver glanced at her, stunned. What? You can't? I said turn around. Shadow barked loudly, as if understanding her determination. Unable to stop her, the driver reluctantly turned back onto the road they'd just left. Arya, don't do this, a woman whispered. But Arya couldn't hear anything else. She only knew she had to find Anthony. The bloody battle. Inside the camp, gun smoke filled the air. Anthony and Nolan fought for every second, but the enemy vastly outnumbered them. A bullet grazed Anthony's arm, blood soaking into his shirt. He still didn't stop. A rebel charged toward him, but before he could pull the trigger, Shadow appeared. The dog lunged at the enemy, sinking his teeth deep into the man's arm. The rebel screamed, his gun dropping to the ground. Anthony didn't miss the chance. He took him out immediately. "Good job, Shadow." But just as Anthony turned around, the gun barrel was pointed straight at him. The enemy's finger squeezed the trigger. Everything seemed to slow down. Bang! The gunshot echoed loudly, but Anthony didn't fall. Another body had thrown itself in front of him. It was Arya. She collapsed to the ground. Anthony froze, his eyes wide with shock. "No!" He rushed forward, holding her tightly. "Arya, you can't do this to me." Blood soaked through her shirt. Her breathing grew rapid. "I told you to come back to me. Did you hear me?" Anthony pulled her closer, tears falling down his face. "I heard you. I heard you." Right now, nothing else mattered. He had to get her out of there. In the final moments of the battle, Anthony, Nolan, and Shadow fought their way out. The rebels, despite their numbers, began to retreat after suffering heavy losses. Anthony lifted Arya and carried her to the car. Shadow ran beside them, eyes filled with worry. Nolan started the engine. The vehicle sped away, leaving the battlefield behind. In the car, Anthony held Arya tightly in his arms. "You're not allowed to die? Do you hear me?" Arya opened her eyes, weakly touching his face. "You have to go home to Leo." Anthony squeezed her hand tightly. "I promise." Her grip gradually loosened. But Arya was still alive. Nolan pressed harder on the gas, speeding toward the nearest hospital. Anthony sat there, holding his wife tightly. He had lost Arya once. He wouldn't lose her again. The engine roared as the vehicle raced down the rough roads, leaving behind the flames and gunfire. Anthony Scott held Arya close, his eyes never leaving her face for even a second. "Hang in there, Arya, we're almost there." Nolan sat in the driver's seat, eyes fixed tensely ahead. They couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Shadow whimpered beside them, his eyes as anxious as Anthony's. He understood that everything was about to change. When they reached the nearby field hospital, Arya was rushed inside immediately. Anthony stood outside, hands trembling. He had never been so terrified. He'd faced death before, fought on brutal battlefields, but nothing hurt as much as the thought of losing the woman he loved most. "Please, don't leave me." And then he realized all of his memories had returned. Everything. Moments with Arya, days spent holding Leo in his arms, evenings when the family sat together. He had forgotten it all because of the war. But now, standing amidst the devastation, he realized the most important thing of all. Family was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. The final choice. A few hours later, Arya woke up. She saw Anthony sitting beside her, his eyes filled with emotion. "I remember now." Just 3 simple words, but enough to bring tears to Arya's eyes. "I remember you. I remember Leo. I remember everything." Her hand gently touched his face. Her husband had truly returned. 1 week later, as Arya gradually recovered, Anthony sat on the porch of the field hospital, staring at the distant mountains. Nolan approached, lighting a cigarette and offering a faint smile. "So what now?" Anthony remained silent. Nolan continued, "You could stay here, keep fighting as a stateless soldier, or you could go home." Anthony clenched his fists. He had fought for far too long. He had been lost for far too long. Now he knew exactly where he needed to be. 1 month later, Anthony, Arya, and Shadow stood before their home in Tennessee. The house was the same, simple, warm, and always waiting for their return. Arya gently took Anthony's hand. He took a deep breath. This wasn't a battle, yet his heart raced faster than ever. He reached out and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, it swung open. "Leo." The boy stood there, eyes wide as he stared at the man before him. Anthony choked up, lowering himself down. "Leo?" Without another word, Leo rushed straight into his arms. "Dad." Anthony hugged his son tightly. This feeling, he'd lost it for far too long. Shadow sat nearby, wagging his tail. He'd completed his mission, bringing Anthony home. Arya knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around both of them. After everything, they were finally reunited. Anthony Scott fought for 6 long years, but his most important battle wasn't on the battlefield. It was the battle to find himself again. He had lost everything. His memories, his family, his identity. But thanks to the loyalty of a canine companion, the love of a wife, and the bond with his son, he finally found his way home. War can take away many things, but it can never take away a person's heart. And sometimes, a dog can lead someone back from the darkness. What do you think about this story? If this story touched your heart, leave a comment about your favorite moment. Do you believe in the loyalty of dogs? And what are your thoughts about the soldiers who sacrificed their lives to protect others? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to Dog Stories so you won't miss more heartwarming stories like this. Thanks for watching.